The Cubans also had, as a bit of background knowledge, what happened in Guatemala in 1954 with Jacobo Arbenz. Jacobo Arbenz was more or less the Hugo Chavez of his day in Guatemala. Che Guevara was actually in Guatemala at the same time. And Arbenz, no real radical, he was a reformist. He wanted to distribute land a little bit. He wanted to tax the United Fruit Company, who was a monopoly in Guatemala. He wanted to do just simple things, a little bit of a redistribution of wealth, but the US were having none of it, and the United States sent the Marines into Guatemala. Arbenz had to flee, and that was the end of the reformist period in Guatemala. And as anybody heard my talk last year on Guatemala, the tragedy of Guatemala exists right up until this day. The Cubans were also influential with Salvador Allende in Chile. We all remember the 1973 Pinochet coup, but before the coup, Fidel was instrumental actually in helping Salvador Allende push forward some of his socialist policies. One piece of advice that Fidel gave Salvador Allende, that Allende never accepted, and things might have been different in Chile if he had, he told him to give every trade unionist and every worker a gun, because Fidel could see what was coming on. And it was interesting, in the early 1980s, after the US invaded Panama, Fidel gave every Cuban a gun. Now people say, oh, the Cuban people don't like Fidel. Well, if he thought that, he wouldn't have given them all guns, I would imagine. So it's a pretty good sign, but that's what he did. And drawing on the experience of Chile, Fidel gave the workers' organizations and militias weaponry in case the US decided after Panama we're off to Cuba. Nicaragua, Fidel was influential in the Sandinistas uprising in the 70s. The original leader of the Sandinistas was Carlos Fonseca. He was killed actually just a couple of years before the 79 revolution in Nicaragua, but he was instrumental, and he was educated at the university in Moscow and had very close links with the Russians. And he was a great intellect, and you should read his books and his poems if you're interested. Fantastic. It then moved on to Daniel Ortega, who's sitting there next to Fidel Castro. And after the 1979 revolution in Nicaragua, the US put together a 15,000 strong army called the Contras against the government of Nicaragua, because they didn't like the fact that the Nicaraguans were creating health services for the Nicaraguan people. They were creating education for the Nicaraguan people, so they destroyed that. They targeted hospitals, they targeted schools. And Fidel again was instrumental in setting up defences in organising Nicaraguan society. So move on to today. It's rattling through a bit, but we don't have too much time. Nuestra America, I mentioned that before. Today there's a different vision of Latin America. It's not going to be divided up by the way the Americans like it. The Latin American people are coming together, and more than about 430 million people are living under progressive governments in Latin America today, and they call it Nuestra America. And probably the most famous country, or the most talked about, is Venezuela. And they talk about the Cubanization of Venezuela in the capitalist media, and they're always vilifying Hugo Chavez as a dictator, as a friend of Fidel Castro, as though that makes you a bad person. And even in what we would call the more progressive broadsheets in this country, The Guardian, Rory Carroll just constantly writes utter nonsense about Venezuela. And every time I come back from Venezuela, I just can't believe it's the same country I'm reading about. One example, when I was over there last year and I was interviewing this woman, she was 58 years old, and she was crying, and I asked her why she was crying. And she said, Hugo Chavez was the first president that cared about the poor, and she'd gone 56 years of her life without being able to read and write, and he had now made it free for poor people. And that is the Venezuela you don't read about in the papers here today. It's also worth mentioning that he's stood in more than 10, his democratic credentials have been put forward on more than 10 occasions, some with elections, some with referendums. You can never imagine our politicians in this country putting themselves through what Hugo Chavez has done in a democratic way. Bolivia, also very close to Cuba. We probably know a little bit about the water war in Cochabamba in 2000 in Bolivia, and that actually led to Evo Morales, who was a trade union leader at the time, becoming the president of Bolivia. Well, what the Bolivian government at the time did was privatize the water, yeah? And the Americans, or Bechtel company, through the Americans, give the ex-president $5 million to privatize it. As soon as the water was privatized, only about 12-13% of the country could actually afford water. They then passed a law that said it was a 2-year prison sentence to collect rainwater in buckets. So more than 800 people died through having no access to water, which just seems like a fantasy tale, but is actually the truth. And therefore the Bolivians organised against all odds, and they elected a trade union leader as president of their country with organisational help again from Cuba. Today in Bolivia there are more than 13,000 Cuban teachers with the Yo Si Puedo alphabetization program helping bring Bolivians out of illiteracy. Ecuador, when they elected Rafael Correa, another left-wing president in Latin America, another one whom the United States are actually trying to destabilize in Ecuador through military funding of opposition groups. Again, Rafael Correa has been speaking to Cuba about how to cope with these attacks, how to set up neighbourhood watch groups, neighbourhood militias, etc. And this is why Cuba is so important, because they've seen it for so many years. They actually know how to deal with this. They've tried to assassinate Fidel Castro more than 600 times and failed every time, yet they call Cuba the terrorist state. I mean, you just can't make it up. El Salvador and Cuba. Well, last year I was covering the election in El Salvador for Tribune, and it was the most remarkable thing. The El Salvadorians went through, which was probably one of the most brutal civil wars in the 1980s, where over 80,000 people were killed. The US-backed military tortured men, women, children. They obliterated schools, hospitals, but still they didn't overcome the FMLN guerrillas in the mountains, who were setting up their own schools in the mountains. What you've got to remember about these groups, they weren't just setting up military attacks, they were actually setting up schools and hospitals and trying to build this society they wanted, even during the conflict and the massacre that were going on. The massacre of El Mozote is one that's quite famous in 1981, where with the help of the US, the El Salvadorian military surrounded a whole village and put all the women and children and men into different schools, different hospitals around the village, set them on fire and killed everyone in the village, apart from one woman who managed to escape, and her story now has been told, but they wouldn't listen to her at the time. They said she was lying, she was making it up. But now there's a very good book called The Massacre of El Mozote, which is well worth reading if you're interested. But I've covered about 8 elections in Latin America, and the one in El Salvador last year touched me the most. It was just an incredible feeling to be on the streets of El Salvador when, after that civil war and 10 years of the Reina Party, who were the party who were linked to the government, that were causing all these atrocities during the war, actually won the election, and the FMLN elected Mauricio Funes as president. It was just an incredible thing to witness. When we're talking about Cuba, we can't forget the Miami 5 either, when we're talking about terrorism. For years, from Florida, there were attacks in Cuba. One instance, an Italian tourist was killed when they blew up a hotel reception area. So what the Cuban government did was sent some Cubans over to Florida and Miami to find out what was going on, so they could actually find out when these attacks were going to take place, and they could stop them so there'd be no more massacres in Cuba. Fidel Castro told Bill Clinton at the time what was going on, and Bill Clinton said, yeah, well, that's good. Who are these guys that you've got in Florida? So he said, all right, I'll get them to liaise with your people, and we'll take all the files we've created along. So along went the Cubans with all these files, and the Americans arrested them. Not the people who were causing the terrorism, but these people that were actually trying to find out who the terrorists were and to stop it. And these people are still in prison today, and a lot of us are still part of a campaign to get these people released. It's an incredible story. Even the author Garcia Marquez went to the American government to say to release these people. It's a tragedy what went on there, but again, it shows that under Obama, it still doesn't look like anything too big is going to change, and we need to still campaign to release the Miami 5.